People always say God is all good, but what if God was all bad? Let's talk about it.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast, where we discuss the gray areas of the Christian faith.
And boy, are they gray.
Yeah, answering some Christian philosophical questions and maybe problems in the world. And today, we're going to be discussing, like you heard, what if God was evil?
Yeah.
You know, the whole time we've been prepping for this episode, I just have been thinking of, what's the opposite of Superman? From Zod. Have you ever watched Superman with...
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the name.
Yeah, his name's... No, General Zod is his name.
Oh, okay.
He's just evil Superman.
Oh, cool.
But I think, why do I think of evil God and think of a Superman character that just wants to destroy everybody?
I mean, Superman kind of is the Christ character for a lot of, like, comic books, at least. And, like, in America.
That's a pretty weak God if a little crystal hurts him.
Technically, he is a god, like, within the comic books. Like, he can't die.
Well, true, yeah. So, if God is evil... This is... Where's the camera? Sad face. I just found it there on the desk.
So funny. It's been there forever.
Sorry for everyone on audio. We do a lot of stuff on the camera that you can't see.
Yeah, you gotta start watching it.
Sad.
Yeah, so today we're talking about a really interesting philosophical paper that was published in 2010, I believe, by Stephen Law. And he created this paper, and it was in response to the Christian idea that God is a maximally good being, right? So we usually say God is all good, but a little bit more precise of a sentence is saying God is maximally good. So the maximum amount of good that God is, or that could be, God is that, right? So the most that it is, it's like saying he's a maximally supreme, meaning he's like maximally powerful, right? Like, instead of saying like all of the power that there is, it's just a little confusing. If you say the most power that there is, he is that or he has that, it's a little more, it brings a little more clarity to the subject.
It makes more sense.
And so Christians have always believed that God is a maximally great being, a maximally powerful being. He is spatially everywhere, right? He has all the knowledge, but he is also maximally good, right?
Do you think he has knowledge or he is just the explanation of knowledge?
I don't understand what the explanation of knowledge would even mean.
I just kind of threw it out there. But the idea that, like, I'm sorry to derail you in your whole thing.
Okay,
Just was...
He has knowledge.
Well, it's like...
Is the answer out of those two.
But then knowledge is something that you could possess, but, like, he doesn't need to have it. He just is. He's not knowledge himself, I would say. He just...
I mean, he doesn't have experiences in that, like, sense of knowledge. Like,
Fair.
we have experiential knowledge, but he still has some kind of knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just say he's like the culmination of everything that can be known.
Yeah.
He is, I guess. Maybe that probably has some
might be too deep for
problems.
some of the people listening. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. It popped up and I got really excited.
No, yeah. Or I could be underestimating the mental power of our listeners. I'm sure you guys are very intelligent.
You jerk.
Yeah. I'm a dingus. Sorry. All right. So we're talking about if this paper, right? Where was I? We're talking about how God is maximally good, right? So not that he like points to a standard of good or creates a standard of good, but that he is maximally goodness, right? He is good. So if God's essence is maximally good, then why couldn't God be maximally evil, right? So that's the idea of Stephen Law that he tried to publish in this paper in refuting like the idea of not that a God exists, but that maybe a God does exist. Why does he have to be maximally good? Why are we making that inference? Why couldn't he be maximally evil, right? And then as soon as you make that statement, you come into this realm of two conflicting ideas. Christians usually think of an idea of pervasion when it comes to good and evil, while some people, especially like in Buddhism and Taoism, think of like a dualism of good and evil.
Can you define pervasion?
I'm going to define both right now.
Perfect.
So dualism is the idea of like the yin and the yang, right? That good and evil both exist together, kind of in antithesis of each other, right? They both have to exist, and they both are like the light and dark of each other, if that makes sense, right? They're both substantive things that both exist, and everybody is part of them, right? Of good and evil. So that's much more like an Eastern kind of philosophy that a lot of people, I think, believe. Like, it's in a lot of movies. Like, you see, like, oh, everybody has their own inner demons, and like I'm always partially good, partially bad. And there's some like parts of that we kind of see within Christianity too, that are good, but I think the idea as a whole isn't necessarily a Christian idea. Within Christian philosophy or philosophy of religion, many more Christians subscribe to the idea of pervasion. And what pervasion is when something is distorted, right? So the theory of pervasion within good and evil, within a Christian context, is that evil doesn't have substance, but it is the pervasion of good, right?
The corrupting of good.
Right. So good is the thing that we want and is the thing that has substance. There's a neutral level where there's just nothing. Like there is no good or evil. It's just a neutral line. And then it can go to good. And there's good and neutral. Okay. Right? But evil is just the pervasion or the distortion of what is good. Right? So it doesn't necessarily have substance. It's just when something that is good goes bad. Right?
Okay.
Or using something good in a bad way.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like we can use language which is good in a bad way, which makes it bad, right? Yeah. You want any more explanation or clarification on that?
No, I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, you would say that then bad is not an original thing. It's just not. It's just like would it be an absence of good or a twisting of good?
Yeah. You can say that it's both of those things. That bad is. It's not an absence of good, like it doesn't have any substance whatsoever. So just like darkness has no substance, it's the light that had substance. It would be the same kind of idea, that goodness is what exists and what has substance, what has, like, you could say it has atoms, even though it doesn't have atoms. Like, you could say goodness has atoms, and when all those atoms aren't there, then it's bad, right?
Okay.
Like, it isn't necessarily bad, but it would be the lack of it, yes.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
so
guess
it's not like a proven thing. Not every Christian has to believe that, but it is the prevailing philosophy in the philosophy of religion that Christians do subscribe to. And I also subscribe to it. I think there are definite holes in it. We don't have to go into those right now because it gets really deep. But it's going to be really interesting. So when we're thinking about dualism versus this pervasion, it's important within our idea of who God is, because depending on which one you subscribe to, the philosophy doesn't work. Right? So, for example, if we're going to look into, is God evil, right? Then evil would be the thing that has substance, and good would be the thing that doesn't have substance.
Oh,
right?
okay.
And God would be necessarily just evil, and goodness wouldn't exist. It would just be the absence of the evil, right? Everything would just be flipped on its head, if that makes sense. So, it's really interesting. When you go to arguments like the cosmological argument, so like, there has to be causes to things. We make arguments like that. We make arguments like the ontological argument, the axiological argument, to try to prove God's existence, right? All of those still work within this paper, within this universe, this thing we're trying to like dive into of if God could be evil. Those all still exist, right? God is still like what is the ultimate contingency. Like we're all still contingent upon God. God is still like the maximally supreme being, all those kind of things. The only thing that's flipped is that God is now completely evil instead of completely good. And in our minds, we kind of think, oh, it's kind of like a silly idea. Like, why would someone believe that? And I think it's easy to go there just because it's so normal in our culture to think, oh, God is just good. Like, why would I go to this, like, evil God hypothesis? That just doesn't seem to, like, be where I want to go.
Right.
And I think that is interesting evidence. We can talk about that, but it's not great evidence, right?
Evidence for God's goodness?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it is some amount of evidence, because I think how you feel about something naturally is not no evidence. It's just not, like, you can't make a decision based off of that, if that makes sense. So, we got to dive into it and actually give this idea some thought before we can just write it off because of how we feel about it, right?
Yeah.
So why couldn't God be evil? It's really interesting. Do you have any thoughts on it so far?
Why couldn't God be evil?
Yeah, why couldn't God just be all evil?
Yeah.
You don't have to answer that question, but do you have any questions so far as we're going along?
I don't have like technical questions right now. I think I will as we go. I will say I do know that I think I'm outmatched intellectually in this topic because I haven't done as much of research into it, but it's always been, not always, it's something that I thought about probably within the year. In the last year, I probably had this first thought where I was like, whoa, God could be evil.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought, would I follow him if God was evil? And I started thinking a lot about this. So I don't know. I would like to maybe share some thoughts I have in it. And I'm sure it's not at all the definite.
No, it's okay. Let's just have a discussion about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so in my mind, I would think to myself that. So here, this is what I think.
Mm-hmm.
God, being creator of the universe, sets the standard for the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever God is, in my mind, that is necessarily or automatically good.
Okay.
Because God sets the standard. He defines it, right?
Yeah.
So if an attribute of God is mercy, that is good. Like good and God are synonymous in my mind.
Okay.
So if we said good and evil were synonymous, then
Wait, good and you mean God and evil?
sorry, yeah, God and evil were the same.
Yeah.
I would think that if that universe existed, no one in the universe would think that what they think is evil is what we think is evil.
Mm-hmm.
Because if my perception right now is God equals standard, which equals good, then that means God equals standard and he's evil, so evil is a standard, so then now evil is actually good.
Yeah.
So then the whole thing gets...
Sure, yeah.
That's like how my thought process works with it, right? Where I'm like, okay, well then, I guess then murder wouldn't be bad because it would just be part of God's nature, which would be good. So it would be defined from the very beginning as the standard, and that's what we would want to do. And not want to do, but like, that is, if I'm serving this God, that's something I would do, right? But then I thought, well, if God is the maximally supreme being of the universe, I'm scared to be in opposition to him. So I think I would want to serve him. So then I think, okay, if I'm serving God because he's the standard and he's the creator of the universe, I would still, in a way, be obligated to serve him if he was evil. And I don't think I would have the awareness to know that it's evil because it would be all I've known of his character.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So if I can try to shed a little bit of light on what you're kind of saying, I think it's helpful to think of this not in necessarily Christian terms, because we're so used to thinking, oh, if there's a God that he's good, then he loves me and he wants a relationship with me and I want to serve him and it'd be good for me to serve him, right? Where those are all assumptions that we just make because of the God that we serve, where necessarily those don't have to be true. Like, we're used to God's intention for us to be one that is good and is trustworthy and is one that is of an unselfish and sharing kind. But if God is evil, then his attributes are completely different. They'd be attributes of hate and selfishness. They wouldn't be for you to serve him. Why would he want you to serve him? He would have created you so you can suffer, or so he can hate you and like bring suffering upon you, so he can watch you suffer. Right?
Yeah.
There's a whole different flip of why you were created. It's really interesting. Just in like my falling asleep thoughts and thinking about it, because obviously I don't believe it. I think there's proofs against it, which we'll talk about nearer to the end. But if you think about the idea of a God creating human beings, right? So you have this just evil God that exists outside of everything. He's maximally supreme. He doesn't need anything, but he's full of hate for some reason, right? And he's just evil. Like, he has evilness inside of him. Selfishness, hate, all these kind of things inside himself. He's maximally evil. All those things are inside of him. And he decides to create, and we can talk about why or if he'd want to do that, right? But if we're all here, and if God is evil, that means that he decided to create. It was necessary, right? And so we're all here now, and God is evil. What would that look like? What would that mean for us, like, if we're being here? And a thought I had was this, like, there is a lot of suffering in the world, right? But there is a lot of good in the world. Why would there still be so much good in the world if God was evil, right? Because that was...
Are you taking the world right now and saying what
Yeah.
if God's evil in the world we live right now?
Yeah, of course. Because this is the what we're trying to apply to our lives, try to see if God is evil, right? Rather than being good. Obviously, he wouldn't be the God of the Bible, but just philosophically trying to figure out what God is like.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're on the same page of not thinking of a possible world, but thinking of this world.
This world, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, in this world, there's a lot of good and there's a lot of evil we see. And I was thinking, why, if God is all evil, would there still be good in this world? Does it make sense to me? Like, and I was just trying to both steelman the argument against my arguments and just trying to have a fun thought experiment.
Well, you're kind of taking you're trying to flipping it, because we say God is good, but then people say, well, if God is so good, why is there so much evil in the world? You're just saying, rather than having a problem of evil, you have a problem of good.
Yeah. So it's like, why is there so much good in the world if God is an evil God? And I had this really interesting thought that I think was kind of a good point for God being an evil God.
Oops.
Yeah. This is what I was trying to do. I was trying to make good points for this case so I could like build it up as high as I could, so I could still see if I could knock it down. Right?
Yeah.
If it's true, I want to like know what's true. And so I was thinking about it, and I was like, if I was evil, and I wanted to like cause the maximum amount of evil and suffering on a creation for whatever reason, just to see him suffer, how would I do it? And I was thinking, okay, well, like you have images of hell, kind of, and people are just like being tortured forever. And I was like, yeah, that is like very bad. But I started to think like, what are like the worst things I've seen like depicted within like media and stuff like that? Like what are the saddest things that ever happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the saddest things that I've ever seen, like at least within movies, is when you give a character hope, and then you take it away, and then you give them back hope, and you take it away over and over. And I was thinking, wow, like we can see that a lot within our society. And like if I was an evil god, I'd want to have some amount of good for these people, just to have them be able to cling to something. Right? So that I can continually like torture them, and like they're just endlessly, hopelessly hanging on to this like this little thing that's never gonna come true.
I'm really happy you're not God.
And I can continually like dangle this in front of their face while being able to torture them the whole time. And I was like, wow, this is crazy, because a lot of people live like very distressed, like terrible lives, right? Full of hope, that if there isn't a God, would be meaningless, right? Like a lot of people never see like healing in their lifetime, or never see like better financial situations in their lifetime, especially in third world countries, right?
Yeah. You got the whole story of Job.
Yeah, which in reality, like God is their only hope for a better life after this life, right? Even for a betterment in this life, like spiritually. Yeah. Like that seems to be
and possibly physically.
Yeah, it seems to be the best way to better like yourself is going to be spiritually, if you can't change your economic status or like your physical health or something like that. And if God's not changing it for you, like spiritually is the best way you can improve. And so I was thinking about this, and I was like, wow, like that's really interesting. Like if I was this evil god, I would want to create a world that's similar to the one that we have, probably still different, but one that gives people an amount of hope so that I can continue to rip it from them and like cause that like trauma to them over and over. Because if you're just torturing someone and they've just been tortured for the last like 20 years, and that's all they know from their inception is just torture and like strife, like that's all they know, that's just normal to them, like oh, this is just every day, this is the only thing I've ever experienced. But if you experience that like that little bit of hope, you're like, oh, there's now this like wide range of things that I've experienced, and when you take that from me, it's so much more impactful than if this is the only thing I know.
Well, yeah, and the problem you have with that argument is that there are people who exist that don't ever experience problems ever. You know, they're born into a good financial situation, they have a good community, they have good health, you know, and they have a good emotional state, and they might have a little bit of hardship, but there's people who never have problems. So then it's like, why would an evil god want some people to experience no suffering? Yeah,
definitely. I think an interesting answer to that, if I'm playing devil's advocate on the side of evil god, I think an interesting attribute to that is that why not let some individuals, like the 1%.
Yeah. Do you think that would create hope for everyone else then? You're like, oh, they have no...
Not necessarily. It could create disdain within them for the people that are doing well. Like, look at the 1% of the creation. Like, they're like just living in peace and luxury, like while all of us are suffering, and it creates hate for another individual while like suffering in your own.
So you'd say it would be sacrificing 1% of the people, so the 99
for a greater suffering for the 99.
That's messed up, dude.
It's interesting, right?
You're messed up.
It's really interesting. And so I was thinking about this evil god hypothesis, and I was like, that is a pretty good point for this hypothesis. Super just like you can't prove it. It's just all like hypothetical. But I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, we have way more evidences for God being a good God than an evil God.
Right. So I'll go into those now, philosophically at least. Yeah. So,
I would say, do you think it's so in regards to an evil God existing? You know, I guess like you said, the purpose of creation would be this, but I guess I'd be more curious. Like, for you, if you found out God was evil, would you still want to serve him?
No, because I think the only reason you want to serve God is because God wants you to serve him, and he's going to give you something. But if your whatever relationship you would have with an evil god exists, it benefits you none. He doesn't want you to serve him. You don't get anything from serving him. Actually, like the best way to have a relationship with that kind of a god is to rebel against him. That's like the best and most, at least if we still exist in a realm where there's morals, like that is still the best thing to do.
Yeah.
But we're still in this kind of inverse kind of world where we still have our morals of like we still think good is good.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily flipped, even though like God is necessarily the thing that sets the standard of morality, which is one of the problems with it in the first place.
So you would say that, I guess, I would be coming with the presupposition that my experience with a good God makes me inclined to, hey, I want to serve him because he's so good and I don't want to be without him. Mm-hmm. But in an evil world, there wouldn't be that desire to serve him or the necessity to serve him.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I would say so.
Okay.
Would you serve him?
If we're saying that my service with him is not... So I think I would say I would want to serve him only because of the aspect of him being God and being like the one who created everything. And I think, wow, you created...
Yeah.
Hello? See the phone ring? I don't know if you guys heard that in the audio phone
Yeah,
ring.
they definitely probably can. It's going to keep ringing.
It's going to ring for a bit.
Anyways, you want me to get into more...
Well, I just want to finish my thought real quick, and then
sorry.
let's get into the evidences for a good God. I would think I would think, okay, I'd serve God because even if he's evil, he's still maximally supreme.
Yeah.
But then I'm conflicted with the problem that if God is evil, then serving him doesn't do anything for my situation.
Yeah.
He's not going to receive like my service as like, oh, I will be less hateful to you. He'd be like, I will maybe be more hateful towards you.
Yeah.
So the fact that it would look like my service would benefit me none, mm-hmm. I would be like, well, then what's the point in following you? If I can,
right?
Like, if you don't desire me to follow you and my following doesn't do anything for you, then no.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Definitely makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now I want to talk a little bit about the sort of proofs against this and why it kind of fails. And I would say that this argument within the world of the philosophy of religion, it is taken seriously, but it's more of an annoyance rather than like a really good like philosophical proof.
What were you about to say, or this subject?
This subject,
okay.
Right? Because there aren't a lot of super strong cases for it, just for the case that there isn't enough suffering in the world to make it seem like an evil God would exist, and also within our own natures. It would be very strange if a God that is maximally evil would somehow create beings with the antithesis of his nature.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like God created humans in his own image. Not saying that the evil God has to create humans in his own image, but it would be strange that if he wanted to bring suffering to a people, that he would create us with the way the world is. Does that make sense? Like I think the thought experiment that we did, that I kind of explained about him wanting to bring suffering and him giving us hope in order to do that is interesting, but it doesn't seem like there is enough suffering, and it seems like there's way too much hope within our world for that to be true. That's just all hypothetical. So just trying to gauge the waters within the philosophical community, from what I've studied and what I've read, it doesn't seem like it is a very strong case, but it is really interesting, and it is sort of like a mosquito. Like, it's just kind of an annoying, like, kind of thing that people bring up.
Yeah. Do you think that this subject, do you think this could help someone understand the problem of evil, or their question, like, if God's good, how come this? Do you think that them, like, flipping it, saying, well, what if God was evil? What would that look like? Do you think that could lead them to understand how God is good?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's just making it more complicated in an already, like, very complicated subject.
Okay.
But I think maybe if you were very versed in the problem of evil, then you could get something out of it. But it could also just lead you to liking the evil God hypothesis more, too.
Yeah, but you're saying that there's not enough evidence to like, because it's the subject.
Yeah, but I could,
it's an annoyance.
If someone doesn't know anything about it, I could convince them God's evil. Like, it wouldn't be hard.
Right. But so I'm saying, like, because of how much study, if people put study into it, you're saying, like, in the philosophy world, this is more of an annoyance and a mosquito, and people don't really take it seriously. So with the amount of people who don't really take the evil God hypothesis seriously, it implies that they take way more seriously a good-natured God.
Or just be an atheist. Which is usually the people posing the problem. Like, I don't know anybody who believes that God is evil and he created the world. Like, it's a proof made by atheists to, like, have a thought experiment about why couldn't God be this way, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So this isn't held in, like, religious circles.
Yeah, I don't know any religion that necessarily fully believe, like in part, I think some religions might follow this, but I don't think there is a religion that thinks God is a maximally evil being.
Right, me
necessarily.
neither. I just think
at least not that I know of.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me that because people think it's more of an annoyance and they don't take it seriously, that implies that even atheists are like, if even atheists think, well, if a God existed, he probably is good. That would lend to evidence in my mind to, well, God's probably good then.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like a Satan in this like world and be like, no, I want to be good, and like rebels against God. Like instead of like
I'm going to recycle.
Yeah, instead of like wanting to like overtake God because he thought he was the most beautiful being, he's like, it's the opposite of that. But what even is the opposite of that? It's just super interesting. Like the thought experiment if it was the same.
This God, this evil God's commanding Satan, hey, go to all the worlds I created and cause hurricanes. He's like, I don't want to. He's like, that kills them. He's like, yeah, I know. He's like, I don't want to kill them. He's like, what? You don't want to kill them? You're punished. Right. Like you're like, what? Huh?
Right. Like goodness isn't a natural progression for us. Like a progression to pride and taking over and thinking higher of ourselves and being more selfish is the natural human progression, not a progression away from that. So it just makes more sense that wouldn't make sense. So I think one of the main arguments is that it just doesn't make sense within our own human nature that this is the way God would be. Like it doesn't make no sense, but it doesn't make a ton of sense for the natural world we see around us. We do see evil, we do see suffering, but we don't see it in a way that I think a evil God would be or would have created it. Now, that's all conjecture. Someone could just say, well, it is the way I think it would be, and boom, their argument is now as strong as mine, right? So we need more than that. And I think when it comes down to the nature of why God would create, you get one of the strongest arguments against an evil God hypothesis. And so I'm going to explain why Christians think God created, and we can talk about why an evil God would create. So this, I think, is the strongest proof for the Christian monotheist worldview that I know of, at least in my mind. Other people might like the cosmological argument more, or other things, but
I said one of the strongest.
Yeah, in my mind,
more than fine tuning.
Well, it's different. It's a little different. It's more of like, why would God create? Sorry.
Okay.
I shouldn't have said the cosmological argument. It's less an argument for God and more an argument for why we're here necessarily.
Okay.
So it's the idea that if God is a maximally supreme being, and I think I've maybe explained this on the show before, but if God's a maximally supreme being, and he is everywhere, and he has all knowledge, right? That's part of being a maximally supreme being. He has all of the power. Why would he want to create? He doesn't need slaves. He has all the power. He has everything, right? What would he need slaves for? They're not going to bring him pleasure because he has everything, right? Yeah. He doesn't need to do like experiments to find out something, so he doesn't need like scientific like lab rats or anything, right?
Right.
He doesn't need those kind of things. He already knows everything. He already has everything. He doesn't need our worship. He doesn't need our service because he has all. Like, what are we giving him by giving him worship?
Right.
Like, it's not like he's like egotistical and like missing, and he's like, I need to create things to like worship me, right?
Yeah.
Like,
he's not insecure.
It doesn't add anything to him, right? Like, nothing we can do can add anything to him, right? So you have to ask yourself the question: why would a God, any kind of God, good or evil, want to create anything at all if he has everything, right? And the only thing I can think of, besides just saying it has to be that way because we're here, right? Like you could generally say this, and that would be philosophically sound, in my opinion. You could say, well, we have arguments like the argument for contingency, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, all these arguments for why God should exist or why we think God exists. We don't know why he would create. We have these two things, but we're here.
Yeah.
So we seem to be, it seems that God is necessary. We are not necessary beings, but God is necessary, but we're here. So God must have created us for a reason. We don't know that reason, right? You could say that. So, but in my opinion, I think we do know a reason. The only reason I can think of is that God would want to share relationship. Now, the only problem with that is that if you're a God and you're completely sustained within yourself, and you're one being, like you believe, the only maximally supreme beings can be one being. You can't be a whole bunch of like a pantheon of gods, because then they wouldn't all be the maximally supreme being, right? Yeah. They'd be a whole bunch of different beings. The only form this works within, I think, is the paradox of the Trinity, because then you have one being that are also three beings, right? Or that are also three persons, right?
Yeah.
That classic model of the Trinity. Because then you have relationship within one maximally supreme being that can relate to each other, right? While being one God, right? One and three. So that gets you to a place where now this one God has the ability for relationship because he has relationship. Once you have relationship, you have the capability of love. No God that is a maximally supreme being that does not have some amount of persons, more than one within him, could have the ability for love. It's impossible because you have no relationship. There's no such thing as love if it can't be shared, right? You can't just like love yourself forever. That doesn't exist. You are just you, right? And there's nothing else that could possibly be. And so unless you have this Trinitarian view, in my opinion, there is no reason for God to want to create, because the only thing that makes that God want to create, because he has a relationship with himself. He has love within himself. He is fully sustained and satisfied with his love within his parts, right? The only really interesting part about love is that it is not egocentric, right? It is not selfish. It is a thing that shares, right? When you have love, you share the love. Like, have you ever felt just like you're super overwhelmed with love and like the Lord just really filled you that day, like full of love? You're like, oh, I just want to like be really generous, like give people hugs and like tell them how cool they are and like do stuff like that. Like you just want to give to people. Like it's just coming out of
it's
you.
Natural.
Like, I just want to give like myself to people and like make them feel good, right? You're being other centered, and it's just natural from within you. And so it is possible that this God that is full of love, that has a relationship within his own parts, that is in essence love, would not necessarily has to, but would create to share relationship with human beings. That's, or not with human beings, with his creation, right? Essentially human beings, because we're here. But
and also
does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that in my mind is the only thing I've thought of that. Well, not my own original thought, but
like I created this thought all on my own.
This is the only thing that to me makes sense of why a God would want to create human beings. Because if you take, for example, Allah, right? Why would Allah want to create? Like, he doesn't have a relationship within himself. He's just one maximally supreme being. We share the same model of God with Muslims, right? Except for the Trinity
and Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, that's the Trinity, so.
Yeah, but the same model of a maximally supreme, one maximally supreme being. What reason would that God have for creating? Now, I think that's still a sound argument, because you could still say, well, I'm skipping past that part. I don't know why he'd want to create, but he did, and I exist, so I can use that model, right? But we have more of a reason why God wants to create, because he is love, and he has a relationship within his parts, and he wants to give that relationship to humanity, right? Yeah. It makes a lot more sense to me. Now, if you have an evil God, it seems to me that if you are maximally supreme and you're evil, you're completely satisfied within your own evilness, right? There is only selfishness within
I was
you,
just going to say that.
right? So you are maximally selfish and maximally like...
I am not.
I don't think you could really be hateful, because...
There'd be nothing to hate.
There'd be nothing to hate unless you could have self-loathing, but I don't even think you could really have self-loathing, because there's nothing to compare it to. So loathing, I don't know if that would necessarily exist.
Could hate each... If there was still a Trinitarian evil God, you could have, like, hate and war with each other. But
right. So it would have to be a God that is still a Trinity, right?
Then but that seems that if each individual of the being of the Trinitarian evil God is hating itself, it seems like it would try to inflict evil on itself, which kind of makes me think it sounds schizophrenic.
No, possible. So it couldn't still be one being. It would still have to be a trinity of beings in order to even have hate, right? Because you couldn't have hate because there's nothing that could have caused that hate, right? Love has to have a cause because it's between two, or in our case, three persons, right? But you couldn't have hate because there is nothing to exchange that hate with. There's nothing to cause the hate in the beginning.
So you're saying you still need Trinitarian.
You still need a Trinitarian God. So you still need a maximally evil Trinitarian God. Now, it gets interesting, because you could still play that out and say, okay, well, this Trinitarian being, like, inflicts suffering on itself between its own parts, which is what makes it. It shares, like, in its own suffering between its own parts, which is why it's maximally like evil, right? Instead of like being maximally good and sharing love, it shares hate. The distinction I see within this that I think of when I think of this is that love unifies a being, but hatred separates and drives apart. And so it would not make sense to me that a being that is maximally evil would be unified, but it seems like hate and the suffering that is inflicted within a relationship, at least in the relationships that are observable to us, only bring disunity and separation, right, within a relationship.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to me that a being that is maximally selfish and maximally evil, continually causing suffering within its own like members, would ever want to share with a sort of creation. I don't even think that thought would enter its head, because it's so selfish that the idea of sharing anything, I don't think would even make sense to it.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right.
So I think
it would be denying its nature.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strongest proofs against the idea of an evil God by Stephen Law. I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Could you, say someone's out on the street, right, and maybe they're an atheist, or maybe they're talking to someone who kind of entertains this idea. Mm-hmm. I think you could use this argument. Just gonna mute your mic while you drink that water.
Okay.
It's like, I think you could use this argument and say hey, because of these reasons we can infer that God is not evil, thus he's good. Mm-hmm. And then you could start with saying, hey, cosmological argument, we can infer that it's pretty high evidence that God exists, and then use the other argument of the evil God and everything you just said to say this God is good. It seems like those two, or anything that gets people to see how a God could exist, and then paired with this, makes me think that you could pretty strongly argue for a good God and then get them to a place to start to understand or be open to Christianity.
It could be. I think
you could also just preach the gospel and allow the Holy Spirit to work, but if they're more intellectual.
Yeah. I think that it would only really be harmful to do that unless they were really, really intellectual and already had this idea. If it's a problem you need to solve for them, I think it's great. But I think you just creating more problems for them isn't necessarily good if you're trying to get the person to understand God, because it doesn't necessarily help with the problem of evil, because maybe it clarifies some points for you on why God is good and stuff like that, and why some points of evil exist. But it would be way quicker just to go over the proofs against the problem of evil and show that believing in God still can be based, and it would be a little quicker than bringing up another problem. So I think that would be not helpful unless they already had this objection.
Yeah. Well, I don't mean bring up the whole idea of hey, God could exist and here's why he can't be evil. It would be more here a God exists using these cosmological, ontological arguments.
Yeah.
And now here's why we know he's good, because of the Trinitarian.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. I do that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if you guys want to...
That's how I show the gospel every time, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
I just do it the way the Bible...
Because it doesn't make sense to me otherwise.
I just do what Peter did in Acts, and I say, "You killed him! You
killed him!"
So it's so taken out of context.
Oh my gosh.
Non-Jew.
I sent you a video earlier, and it's hilarious, but it's on the same subject. We should talk about it.
Is that on TikTok?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's so funny.
Derry always sends me videos, and I don't have any of my notifications for any social media on, ever, because I get too addicted. And so I'll just check it at the end of the night, and I have 13 videos, and I'm like, ooh, it's a little gifted then.
It's not that bad. The video was this guy, and he was going up to it is offensive at the beginning, but he himself is a Jew, so it's not. He explains it's a prank afterwards. But he's this older guy, and he's going up to other Jewish people in this Jewish market and being like, "Hey, would you sign this petition, saying you're sorry for nailing Jesus to the cross?" And trying to get people that are Jewish to sign this petition saying they're sorry for nailing Jesus to the cross. Sort of in the way of reparations of the evils done to African American people.
Okay,
right? It was sort of in that light. But then he would realize, "Oh, I'm Jewish. It's just a prank. It's just a joke." It is kind of off color, but it's also tough.
Yeah. How do they react?
I did a joke. Oh, they're very offended.
I'm yes, you did. Have you read the Bible? Not you necessarily, but your ancestors.
He was dressed as a priest as well.
Yeah.
But he's very obviously Jewish.
Yeah.
He had the locks
curls.
and everything. It was pretty funny. Anyways,
yeah.
I think one of the last things that I want to say within the evil God hypothesis, right, or theory, which is really interesting, is actually a quote by C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis, long ago, said, "We know no one who loves evil for it being evil, but we do know many people who are good for the sake that they love good." right?
Yeah.
Not an exact quote, but it's obvious to us that people love good, and they just like they want to be good. They want to prosper. They want good things to happen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like the love and desire to go towards good is sort of, I think, part of like the image of God within people that we can still see that hasn't been completely destroyed by the fall, right?
Yeah.
Within people. There is some amount of that still in them that we can see that is part of God's creation. Where you don't see is that people just love evil for it being evil. Like, we do see people who have been, like, hurt a lot in this world, and now are acting out of a place of, like, being evil, right?
Yeah.
Or are following Satan, even in the most extreme example, right?
Yeah.
But it's still out of, like, a broken place. We don't see necessarily, like, beings that are created that just love and thrive off of just being evil, which would make sense we would see those kind of beings if there was a God that was created in that sense. Does that make sense?
If God created them in that sense.
Yeah, if God created in that sense. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I think there's way too many proofs against it. I think it's a really, really, really fun thought experiment, and I have a lot of fun thinking about it all the time, but I don't think it holds a lot of water, necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Very interesting, though.
That's good. So, in conclusion, people might throw around the idea that God could be evil, but as we've just discussed, though that could maybe happen, there's a lot more evidence to say why it's not a reality and why it can't happen.
Yeah.
By nature of us existing, even, it shows that God is not selfish, and
Yeah.
selfish means evil,
Yeah.
right? And so God is good. There's a lot of ways we can observe and know that, especially through Scripture. So get in the Bible, read that, see the goodness of God. And yeah, I just want to encourage you guys listening that, the Scriptures say that in His presence, meaning God's presence, is fullness of joy, and His right hand pleasures forevermore.
Yep.
So in regards to this good God that we just discussed and kind of evidentially kind of proved philosophically or tried to, given evidence for, there is joy and pleasures in His presence. And so get in there and love Him and tell someone about the goodness of God today.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe you can use this little theory as a fun little party conversation kind of thing. What if God's evil? And just start a conversation, and maybe it edifies your group a little bit. That'd be fun.
Or just troll people after church in the lobby and drop it in be in a circle with your pastor and be like,
let them know you're intellectually better than them.
just be full of pride and stomp around intellectually.
Yeah, that's what
everywhere
God
you go.
would want.
So don't do it, because that's what evil God wants. But yeah, guys, thanks for listening. If you found this valuable and helpful, West Side gang, he said.
Let's go, baby.
Please subscribe, it's no cost to you, and it really helps get the show out and get in front of people's eyes so they can come and encounter God.
Yep.
Be blessed in your week and love someone today. Show them love of God in whatever way best suits you and your abilities, or get out of the comfort zone and try something new.
Yeah, you should do that.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming back. Come back next week, and we got some good episodes coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Adios.
And happy holiday season. Bye.